además estamos... ¿Ya? Ok. Ya estamos listos, ¿eh? Ya estamos listos, ¿eh? Federico, sí, sí. ¿Pueden pasar? Muy buenas tardes. Bienvenidos a esta última...
Good afternoon. Welcome to our last panel. In our colloquium, The Siege Upon Civilization from World to World, we would like to welcome Tsitsi Dembarenga, Federico Navarrete, Maricia Velas de Gugotti, and Luisa Tavira. Rosa Beltran will have the honor of moderating this panel. Be welcome, all of you. Good afternoon. It is, of course, an honor to share this panel as a moderator. I'm joined by excellent guests, and of course, we're going to touch on one of the most pressing issues of our times. And sometimes we do hear about art as resistance, but sometimes we don't understand how art and culture can be part of resistance. Specifically, what can we do to build a social awareness? And all of us as well, we build our own through symbolic actions. We are the books that we've read, we're the books that we're reading, we are the art that we visit. Of course, we learn through them, through invisible racism, through institutional racism, through the different manifestations of xenophobia, the ideologies of miscegenation, those other ways to hide our taboo words. The Mexican culture would be race, for example, and one of the words that we use to hide it is miscegenation. And we learn from sexual harassment, social harassment, gender violence. There are states in Mexico where 10 people die every day. And in 2017, according to the figures published recently in El País journal, that means that it's probably higher. This year, 1,439 women have been murdered. That is to say, 5 women every single day. And when it's not an art, it is very hard to understand the terms that we use to name this reality and other realities. What does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean when we are a woman? We don't say a thing. It's not the same thing to be a woman in Oslo than being a woman in Guerrero or Oaxaca highlands. It is not to be daddy's girl than the girl working on the streets. It's not the same thing to be a woman in prison than a woman in university and a free woman with the benefit of culture and education. In arts, we don't find all of the answers, but we do find questions. We have questions framed in a different way, and the mere fact that different artists frame questions, pose questions, through this we can have what people call a critical awareness. But why? How? How can we get to other realities that happen in parallel to the reality that we live every single day? How hate speech generates. How do you take a stand against hate speech? These magnificent speakers that we have this afternoon with us will discuss over the course of 15 minutes each. What is their stand vis-a-vis this question? What is the role of arts and culture as a means for resistance in vis-a-vis exclusion, nonsense, from their different fields? I would like to be very brief in my introduction of each one of them. And then I'll give the floor to them. Marisa Belos-Teguigotia, she is a lecturer, a full-time professor for the Philosophy and Literature School, holds a PhD in Gender Studies from California University, Berkeley. He headed the PUEG, a remarkable director from 2004 to 2013. She is the head of a very interesting project, Women in Spiral, Justice System, Gender Perspective, and Pedagogies in Resistance, a proposal to favor women in prison. She works with women in prisons. She works from different fields, inside and outside the world, that we use every day in freedom. Her work analyzes the creation of new pedagogies with other studies, cultural studies, visual arts, and gender studies. Besides, she analyzes the relationship between race, gender identity, and culture in Latin America. She has published Géneros Prófugos, Feminismo y Educación, where the north and south borders of Mexico are analyzed and the production of cultural identities of indigenous women from Mexico and the Caribbean deciding to migrate into the U.S. A big hand for Marisa, please.
Thank you.
We have with us Federico Navarrete, a historian and a translator. He holds a PhD in Mesoamerican Studies from UNAM and a professor for social anthropology from London University. He specializes in pre-Hispanic history and the conquest times, and has written books like La vida cotidiana en tiempos de los mayas, The migración de los mexicas, and La conquista de México. He translated from Nahuatl and proofread the stories of Cristobal del Castillo. He's a researcher for the Historic Institute, UNAM. Among his most recent books are México Racista, Hacia otra historia de América, and Alfabeto del Racismo Mexicano. This last one is very interesting. He describes the details of how racist Mexicans are. We have heard many times that there's no racism in Mexico because we are a country based in miscegenation, because we live in a democratic system. But Federico Navarrete analyzes how, at the everyday rhetoric level, we have a parallel agenda. We have a hidden rhetoric. We know amongst which they speak this way when you behave one way in your private life and you become another in the public life. It's so interesting, his book, that he makes very interesting and updated quotes. He uses the phrases of politicians and phrases that are, in Facebook, as if they were talking to their relatives, to their friends, their close friends, and they might be thinking that they can think out loud a different way at home than outside the doors of your house, in your private life and in your public life. A big hand for Federico Navarrete. And we have Luis de Tavira, an institution himself, and not only in drama and performing arts, but also in arts in general, because through drama, he has taught us how an actor, how an artist, and a member of the audience, like us, we get ready. We get ready and rehearse before we face the performing art in itself. And I've seen his words as a metaphor. How do we get ready for life? How do we understand life through that lens? He's a playwright, professor, creator of institutions like the Center for Drama, the Casa de Teatro organization. He is a playwright, essay writer, translator, and the creator of tonal analysis that describes the intricacies of drama language that is used in Mexico, Spain, Costa Rica, and many other places. He has directed more than 60 plays and more than a dozen plays abroad. Has been awarded the National Prize for Science and Art in 2006. and the list, there are many, many other prizes in Mexico and abroad. His rigor and his commitment are very clear in his steadfast commitment with drama, in teaching drama and developing the theory of drama. His course on from performing to acting is a landmark. You can read it online. It's wonderful. It's wonderful to be together in these panels because I know that this is going to become an object that you will be able to watch again. Luis de Tavira has described drama as the art that has made us come together more than any other art form. When the play happens, we are there together. Probably we cannot compare that unity to any other art form. And he says that drama communicates what we have in common. That is to say, drama creates communities. A big hand for Luis de Tavira, please. We also have with us Tsitsi Dangbarembara, and we are very happy to have her here for the first time in Mexico. She is well known for us as a novel writer from Zimbabwe, the first remarkable woman writer from Zimbabwe. In 1988, she published her book, Nervous Conditions. It is unbelievable that it's been so long and we still don't have a translation into Spanish. And we couldn't find it in Mexico. We counted in the audience. We have in the audience with Naida Anaya. I'm going to ask a big hand for her. Where is she? Please stand up. Because she is the translator of Nervous Conditions. And thanks to her, we could print this book, and now it's going to be distributed by means of the Veracruz University. So we close this 360-degree cycle. We are going to hear from the author, but we're going to read her book very soon. We will hear why, when she wrote Nervous Conditions, Alice Walker and Doris Lessing recognized her work, among many others, and her book became one of the most important novels of the 20th century. And I said, great women writers. Well, in general, women and men writers. I'm trying to be provocative, that I'm sure that Tsitsi would share her mind about this. So this is the novel that we've been waiting for, and I'm sure it will become a classic. And we could consider it as self-fiction. 20 years ago, you could not call it that way, but it is a novel written from the first person. And it's written back in Rhodesia in the 60s, 20 years after Zimbabwe became independent. And I'm going to read the review. After the domination and the government from a minority to rule over a minority. Now, the Nervous Conditions, the title, make reference to Jean-Paul Sartre's introduction of the also well-known work, a classic in theory, of course, Frantz Fanon, The Wretch of the Earth. The Wretch of the Earth, Los Condenados de la Tierra in Spanish. And Nervous Conditions makes reference to the native peoples of colonized countries. Well, that condition that it's in us as well, as an offspring of a colonized country that in many senses we're still a colonized country. As a novelist, Dan Berenga, besides Nervous Conditions, Condiciones Nervosas in Spanish, she wrote the Book of Not, published in 2006, and she wrote the story of Neria, the film in 1983, a film that became in this history of Zimbabwe, the film that was a blockbuster. And she directed Everyone's Child, the first long film directed by a black Zimbabwean woman. Tsitsi, For many years, she lived in that part of the world, the West. And actually, the novel takes place in London. She describes education, about how a girl was trained in London, and the discovery of that institutionalized racism that it's very hard to name, and what happens when she comes back. So Tsitsi, many years ago, 17 years ago, moved back to Zimbabwe in the year 2000. And when we come to the Q&A, we would like to hear from Tsitsi what is going on in Zimbabwe right now, because the news in the last 3 days have been pretty concerning. Welcome, Tsitsi. A big hand for her, please. Very well, so let's begin with our presentation in the same order that I introduced. Then Marisa, please, you have 15 minutes.
I wrote asking for permission, maybe 1 more minute than the 15 minutes. It was very difficult for me to answer the question that Rosa Beltran was asking me in a very concise manner. That is the reason for this panel, which is accounting for how to take position from art, literature, and culture in general in the face of xenophobic events, violent events, racist events, misogynist events. How specifically do we construe the critical thought and the social conscience, social awareness? And Rosa, she's so eloquent always, and she has such ease of a word. She says that art gives questions but no answers. So let me try to give an answer, a very precise answer. I've done it in 5 different operations. People say, well, art, how much of an art is this? How artistic? And this is very artistic. This is not artistic. So what I want to do here is develop with the clarity that I can do it with. I've done it. This is a millimetric work. I will talk about 5 operations that have to do with the body, how it appears. And in this movement, when you go to a classroom and you say your name, you say present. Yes, and present, I'm here. So the fact that you are making yourself present, and I do this with shame because Luisette Tavira is here, and I will talk about scenes and bodies and theater in general. So please apologize. Please forgive me. And later you're going to be helping me because then we're going to be talking about these things because I know you'll improve things that I'm saying. The calls for presence. This is, I've written it because if not, I'll take really strange paths. Calls for presence, 5 maneuvers to make the body appear. This presentation has to do with the identification of 5 maneuvers for the appearance of gestures and critical things that show a positioning and stances, presence of the body in the academic scene. When the body appears, you have an inclination to action. And with this inclination, I mean physical things, an inclination to action when you leave your axis and you go somewhere else, and this can make you turn over. This is a call to action and intervention, inclination to do things. So we're talking about politics of appearances or apparitions in terms of presence itself. So I will talk about the inclinations towards the body and towards its appearance or apparition. I'm talking about the present as when they do roll call in a classroom or political rallies. How much are we present in this reality of Mexico with so many absences and disappearances? What type of presence do we have in our university political lives, our social life? Appealing to the presence of the body in a moment of so much disappearances, of so much absences, so much violence, and so much violence against bodies constitutes a political action of taking of positions, and this is a political artistic action. I'm taking a term of Diane Taylor that she just published in an article. She called it corporalized commitment. So in this work, in this paper, I'm talking about public universities and academia that is so inclined. This is an inclination such as this one. And I think I have to push the button this direction, right? No, there we go. If you see here, this inclination. When someone's running, when you have the appropriate technique to run, so the central axis of the body, it moves forward, and then you move your leg. And then you see how this moves. The body is moving forward and it's out of its own axis. So we have a better one here, do we? Sorry? Yes, let's see. Here we go. Let's leave it here for a few seconds so that everyone can see it. This is how you lose your central axis and you're pushing the body forward, and how you are giving way to a movement, a motion. So appealing to the presence of the body in a moment of so much disappearance has to do with this idea of the intervention of the artistic and the political things. I'm wondering about public schools, such an inclined academy to be and to make the bodies present that leaves its center and it stands over its head. It stands on its head. This is the tattoo of one of the students. She's a doctor now. She did this tattoo, and the academy is upside down. What this is all about, when the body appears, it's to putting this academy upside down, to press it to its limits, and to find social urgencies, emergencies, being inclined, tilting over, losing your center of gravity, displacing yourself, can mean turning over. A public university that puts at risk all its inclinations as decentralizations, living its own axis, makes the body be present from the bottom to the top, and also granting it in social emergencies. That's how the public institution talks about the notion of limit, which is just its contact, its crossover, its crossing towards social urgencies, the most radical otherness. So it explores a vasculation, which produces this inclination, this reversed, inverted thing that inclines towards social issues with a presence in spaces that are sometimes unthinkable. That's the inclination of the classroom that is going to the limit, going to interventions. This is the result of a call. This call, according to Octavio Paz, is always a call to action, a call to an inevitable inclination to act. How are those calls for the body generated? In terms of schools, for instance, what type of a scene are we talking about? These questions make us define the term pedagogical scene, which means acting, performing, being present with your body. So a scene is placed in the interspaces of the academy, a border among disciplines, academic, oral writings, and also privileged subjects and precarious subjects, text, images, and different unthinkable things that seem to be impossible, predictable, unpredictable things. This confirms the resistance to discipline, not only to discipline as a conceptual limitation, but discipline as these forms of framing academic life, which is the more traditional ways. Damon Taylor talks about the concept of the scene as this other radical, the migrant, the person in jail, the prisoner, and this is their own, and the migrant as well, and this is just the borderlines. So the scene is a liminal thing that where we see in this liminal thing the characteristics, the forms, the shapes, the frameworks, and everything are displaced. Everything's out of its own axis, so we vasculate the body towards its limits. And the pedagogical analysis we want to build interrupts the curricular programs, and it has different scenes. This is the second operation. The first one is the inclination. The second one is interruption. In the scene, we consolidate interruption. Second move, the obstaculization of everyday things that happen at the institutional level in terms of the academic life. That which is expected, speaking at the institutional level. The interesting thing about this inclined pedagogical scene is that not only that it interrupts, but there's a change of bodies. You recognize yourself in the other, not only being in someone else's shoes, you are trading yourself for the other. So in Bodies of the Politics, the author says that it's precisely this interruption, gathering, unification, and changing yourself for the other that constitutes the political aspect, not only putting yourselves in the in other person's shoes, but it's finding yourself in time and space. One of the institutions that is further away from this, being able to change yourself for others, of giving your body, of being recognized, as jail, prisons, because you're studying without being afraid of changing yourself for another, without corporalizing yourself in that. This presence, changing yourself, this bordering process with the other women in jail, and the jail itself, it's a pedagogical boundary, it's a political territory. The women in a woman who's prisoner in a classroom, for instance, this is what I'm trying to teach how to show how we did it. This is a woman in jail right in the classroom. She's a prisoner, and how the student can lead to a prison pedagogical scene. These maneuvers, there's three of them: inclination, interruption, and bartering or changing yourself for others. And this has to do with the word present. This presence, which is inverted, it has to do with not only the inversion at the intellectual and energy levels, but it's standing on your head is one of the things that makes this action into an artistic action. Art has a topology and mechanics as well. This is what I'm trying to show here. That is changing, making those bodies present at their limits. A prisoner, a woman prisoner, being in the classroom and occupy partially or just momentarily her place, giving our body for her body of the body of the prisoner, and vice versa. How do we go into this type of changing ourselves for others? Not in any scenario, not in any stage. This is the school stage. This is appearance at the limits, at the boundary, and then changing our bodies for someone else's body. One of the ends of this positioning is talking about non-anticipated spaces, where the ground of interruption, the construction of a sort of pedagogy of amazement. And this is one of the prisoners here. We brought her here. Let's see. She's eavesdropping, or we're in the construction of a pedagogy of shadows. What anticipated space more than the pedagogical space? What a shameful, yes. And then something which is in the unexpected. And the contact between the jail and the classroom, the university space, this way of looking the jail and looking at the university and vice versa. What limit is touched when it's a women's jail? And what are the effects of this changing of academic and penitentiary bodies? How are their disciplines modified? How do they converge? How their subjects are repositioned? I will now talk about the construction of this pedagogical, artistic, political scene of the meeting place, of the recognition and the changing of inmates and students, and the way we are connecting this to action. We've interrupted discipline, and we've also exchanged our bodies, interchanged our bodies, our spaces, and our times. This set of operations, this changing into other inclination, interruption, talk about unthinkable spaces and its continuity, universities and jails, and contact among subjects and unexpected spaces, times, and spaces that are changing one for the other. And now, this spiral thing, just a system, gender perspective, and they work. And this is the School of Philosophy and Literature, Human Rights, and the Aesthetic Research Institute. This is the tilted or inclined classroom with women inmates and also with students with corporalized pedagogies. And this, which is modifying its foundations in the case of writing, for instance, whenever instead of giving quotes or footnotes to build an academic text, this is like falling over, like stumbling. And this is the way this footnote is presented. And this has to do with subjects that are other subjects. Let us now look at this slipping, this slipping, and this stumbling over things towards changes in their own disciplines. Interruption of the academic times. In the displacement of academy in jails, this is interrupted. When we go to jail every Monday for 9 years, we've been going there, sometimes on Wednesdays as well. The entire day is there. We work there. The students negotiate their absence in other classes because they want to go and work in the prison. Prison work demands attention, everything, at every moment. There's a sort of diffuse attention, also centralized attention to what is being said in the midst of unstoppable noise. Open spaces that are constantly being interrupted and surveilled, and listening with attention without any judgments, but listening very careful, working with all types of crimes, offenses, and all types of women. There's no distinction, no special selection. Interruption of jail time. There are 3 calls, roll calls every day, and they have to go there, and if they are not there, they are going to go to the dungeon, and they have to be there. They are there in jail, but they're disappeared outside. Their bodies are being punished, and they have corporalized commitment, captive bodies. This corporalized action, it's working from 6 to 5 every Monday, videos, making videos, doing theater, and so this is the body of the women inmate in jail, and always involuntarily, and this has to do with autonomous free time instead of the dead time of punishment. And law students, education students, political science, psychologists, social services activists, and investigators, they debate and work with the inmates. They are all there, the women that are there, the women that are already convicted, women that murdered someone, crimes against health personnel, and police women. Work can suspend one of the actions of the punitive jail regime. This is the obligated presence without a body. This is the roll call. And this obligation to jail discipline is interrupted with this call coming from this type of work, which is the present with a free and a body inclined and given to action. This roll calls in absence, it's when we work in the inclined or the tilted classrooms here at the university, and the authorities don't even realize that time becomes like flowing time. It flows, that is here present, and this is the way it is always present also in jails. And the Alec scene, the body, it changed for another one. Exchange for another one. We started working with Antigona Sophocles, a rereading of this work with the purpose of finding tragedy as an ideal format in this fatal spaces of women against the destroyed tyrants, and tragedy as a strategy involving the body that's turned into action. The characters have a fatal destiny, fate, final destruction, and collapse. And Sophocles in the what we did in the Santa Marta jail, right outside in the yard, and you see the place where we had at this palm tree house, and the women were gesticulating, and we saw how they identified themselves with Antigone. They were talking about their tragic silence and punishment, but also as bodies that were looking for rest, recognition, identifying themselves with Polynesia. But it wasn't until we consolidated the reading of Furious Antigone and that we were able to have an appearance in terms of their own bodies within the cave. The cave where Antigona hangs herself, of course, jail. And we designed workshops in this pedagogical scene, a performance reading with the appearance of the other radical in the scene, the body of this woman inmate, and the way they're punished in this cave because they were disobedient. It was women there with a disappeared body, feasible of appearing, being reinserted in other scenes when the plot annulling them appeared. And this is every Monday with a corporalized commitment, and also reading these tragedies. And this video spoke about women protesting, women hanging from the rope, women who were protesting against arbitration and unfair actions. And this is a rhetoric, this a woman crying for her brother's body, something that's right in the blood, someone in this bloodbath, and that's her brother. We can see the story of a protest and dissidents, group of women in countries intervened by dictatorships or authoritarianisms that we see in the 80s, for instance, that we saw in the 80s, but with young people out in the public squares to give bodies to absent bodies, and that disappeared. I am referring to the multitudes in Bellas Artes that drew on cardboards the faces of thousands of people who've disappeared. We took those to jail as well. Women, the purpose of this is women to go back to their own bodies as the body of that has disappeared, that's outlined as such, but it claims to be recovered, recognized, acknowledged. An oxymoron, a disappeared body, but always present. It, this consists, the silhouette exercise that we did has to do with the body natural scale put on paper. So then on the walls of the city as a way of representing the presence of absence, those of thousands of people that are detained and disappeared in the last military dictatorship. This silhouette exercise a political movement with an artistic practice. In the prison there, we turned it into a classroom, and the women are there on the ground, and they start outlining their contours, and that's where they become Antígonas Cedillo, and they give themselves their own last name to Antígonas. They want to be there, they want to be there, they want to be known. They are the subject of the appearances of their own bodies. The silhouette is positioned, then it's on the wall, and they stand up right on the wall. They come erect on the wall. They find their own bodies. With the silhouettes, we ask these inmates, these women, where do you want to appear? Where do you want to be? And the first place of appearance that they're asking for is the classroom at UNAM. The students that are visiting them, they want to go to the classroom. So we took up the silhouettes from the jail at 5 p.m. that Monday, and we took their silhouettes to the university. We took them and we took the students into the jail. And this is Wednesday, 9 to 11. We presented the silhouettes to students here at the university, the product of the reading of this wonderful Greek tragedy. This is the transition of a body that's imprisoned, subject of punishment, and the ambulating body, a present body that's displaced, that comes, that's inclined, that tilts, that goes here, that moves. It's not a hurting body. It's a free body with defined gestures that they themselves defined. At the university level, the students interrupted this. They said, this is a furious Antígonas. What happened in Buenos Aires? What happened at the cafe shops there? What are people talking about? So we interrupted the reading of this work, and we started talking to Angela Anghini, and the students started hanging themselves. They started jumping. They started provoking conversations. As Antígonas does in Angabaro's image, she goes and starts talking to people and having coffee. And so they do things in the classrooms, out in the corridors, out in the public squares, and they hold a dialogue. Not only the inmates, not only this woman. The image you see there behind is the women in jail. You see the pictures of the women. They're projected, and this is the women doing their own silhouettes in the classrooms. So a dialogue starts on the forms in which not only the women in prison, but they themselves have been disappeared as well. Sexuality is one way of disappearing. Quality, poverty, shame, feminicide in its own communities. They decide to draw their own bodies on cardboard, and they decide to do it. They want to leave those jails. They want to go to the public squares, to the classrooms. They want to visit the Antígonas from Santa Marta, another jail with all last names, Sanchez, Gutierrez, and Perez. A definitive event that gave way to, after working with whatever we run into. When you're working this way, you work with the obstacles, all the roadblocks that you find. And this is what happened. Exactly before this date, we were working at the end of this video we were doing, the short we were making. And we had the scene of the burial in the cave, but we didn't have the end to show the corporal presence of Antígonas, of lost bodies, and of the way they were trying to avoid being present. So the Monday after the earthquake, the inmates received us with a story. It was truly exceptional. They said, well, they wanted to take us back after the earthquake, take us out of the yard, and we had to be in our own jails. And the earthquake was overwhelming. So how can we overcome this? They resisted this, and they organized a sit-in just next to the place where we had been working, the inclined classroom. They protest. They said, we're not going back. We're not being locked in. Make sure that there's no risk, they said. We cannot go back. If this happened in the Álvaro Obregón building that fell with 49 people dying there, this would be another story, they said. So we are not going to go back to our jails. We have to avoid this jail discipline through our own bodies, through our own presence in this inverted classroom. How did they make the institution listen to their words? They were organized, and they had the sit-in, and they were completely organized. This is the generation of collectivity. But the story doesn't end here. As a collective of President Antigonas, they look at the collapse and the disappointment of the city itself. They are the ones in Santa Marta penitentiary of collapses. They are experts in cataclysms and collapses. They knew what was happening at the university level. They asked us to take them here to the museum next door to talk about their experience in collapses, how they've learned about everything in life. They wanted to talk about loss and social urgency and emergencies as experts to heal so much pain. And at the end, this is what they said. Here you can see segments of their presence at UNAM. Just one more minute. That's precisely because they're taking a message of what is happening really in jail. What are we living in jail? How have we rebelled? Antigone, she rebelled. She went over the line. She did more than what she should have done. And her story will really, I'm so grateful that you picked her because this is a great metaphor, definitely, of what we are living here in jail. In our cave, this is our cave. Well, this is our cave. This is the name of our cave. Seismic alert, seismic alert. This is what we hear. Seismic alert. Seismic alert. Good morning. Thank you so much for being here in this conference organized by the National University of Mexico. This is the Contemporary Art University Museum in the Magallanes Center to know exactly what to do in the next tremor, in the next earthquake, how to live in rubbles, and how to live when we've lost everything. We've invited a group of experts who've lived in recent years in these conditions. They've organized themselves as a group called the Antigonas, and in a very particular manner, well, they are inmates and they are prisoners. If they want to say exactly where are we going, well, this is an expanded wave. They are come here to this expanded classroom where there are activists, where there are people. I see most of the people here are women, political scientists, art history, education specialists. So let me leave you here with the Antigonas from Santa Marta. They're offering their knowledge in experience in interment. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you so much. I want to thank the university and for organizing this Sophocles Century 21. And I am a specialist. I'm used to living in rubbles. I've been locked in for 9 years. I'm Antigona Angeles Lopez. I'm Antigona Chavez. I'm simply Edith, the rebellious Antigona, a woman defying authorities. I was tried without being listened to. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Marisa. I had the opportunity of being a participant in one of these conferences at MUAC, and I was part of this moving experience about a collapse structured. You can live such a collapse inwards and outwards. We are privileged to be here alive, and in my case, not only people close to me at work, at home, and experiencing this exchange with Santa Marta inmates, it talks about an absolute collapse. And through Antigona, they can use it as a catharsis and speak to us. So it's going to be very interesting to hear from the audience and their questions. Before I give the floor to Federico Navarrete, I would like to say that after each speaker's expose, we will have a brief talk between us. And in the end, we're going to read some of the questions that you raise. So you can write your questions, and we'll have all the questions being brought to us. Now, Federico Navarrete, please. It is my pleasure and an honor to be here. I'm going to read my talk in order to be as clear as possible. Mass. At the end of the battle, and the soldiers dead, and a man approached and said, "Don't die, I love you so much." But the corpse continued to die. Other two approached and said again, "Don't leave us, courage, come back to life." But the corpse died continuously. To him, 20, 100, 1,000, 500,000 people claimed so much love and not being able to fight death, but the corpse continued to die. Millions of people surrounded him with a common claim, "Brother, stay with us," but the corpse, kept dying. Then all men in earth surrounded him. The corpse looked at them, sad, moved, rose slowly, hugged the first man, and walked away. This poem, Mass, was written by Cesar Vallejos in 1937 amidst the atrocities produced by the Spanish Civil War, whose sadness made him died eventually. I really didn't understand its possible significance, yes, and imaginary meaning, but it was until 2014 when thousands of Mexicans demonstrated down the streets and tried to make my voice heard to find alive 43 students from the Teachers Trainers School in the rural area of Ayotzinapa and forcefully disappeared by the hands of the armed forces on September the 26th, 2014. Over those months, filled with fear and indignation, but also with hope, 100, 1,000, 500,000 men and women, young and old, we surrounded those invisible bodies that we wanted to see alive, but already dead, in order to rise once again and to bring them back. To fill that terrible gap that their silent faces and their silent names left today, more than 3 years after these 43 students, as many other thousands of men and women in our country, and of course uncountable foreigners, are still disappeared. As Vallejo's crowds had so much love, so much love, couldn't fight the death. The precarious solidarity and amazing solidarity that we saw in the streets were defeated by the force of the official masquerade and the raw historic facts, the fact true, by the silence of indifference, by the brutal reality of necropolitics that is encumbered in many regions in our country. As David Huerta said in a poem also written over the course of those days, this is the country of graves. This is the country of howls. This is the country of burning children. This is the country of women in martyrdom. This is the country that yesterday started to exist, and today we don't know where this country is. The first and sometimes the only people that approach the murdered bodies, the corpses, are the bereaved, the relatives of those who have been tortured and executed. They don't question what will happen. They just want to know the fate of the relatives, to hug them as that Vallejo soldier, or at least to cry for them, to bury them with the minimum dignity that we all deserve or should deserve. Right now, I picture in my mind that hundreds, thousands of them are around a police precinct, the army headquarters, the corpse deposits. They are digging land to find mass graves. They are afraid to find the traces and the remains of their loved ones. Their search is a desperate and lonely one because the state is not helping. The state that is used to cover violence, to cover the kind of violence that criminals perpetrate, or together the state and criminals perpetrate together. In the society, there are some organizations that support them. Therefore, it's tragic to see that these same people fall victim to criminals or the public forces, or both together, because sometimes both represent the same thing, because one of the traits of the violence harassing us is that assassins never show their identity or their reasons. Beyond these intimate circles, it is a shame that in just a few cases you have 100, 1,000, 500,000 shouting out how much they love the lost ones. This is due to that dark cupboard that we see in racism and the war rhetoric that have hijacked our society for many years. For more than a decade, the government has criminalized many sectors in our population. Being accused as a criminal is never proved because in just a few cases there is a valid guilty plea to substantiate that claim. But to the eyes of the president, the army, the press, and most of society, that's enough to justify that someone or many are detained without an arrest warrant, tortured, murdered, or enforced fully disappeared. This is just an example of tens of cases. On June the 30th, 2014, the Mexican army massacred 22 people in Tlatlaya in an operation. It seems to be a very far away town, but it's 214 kilometers where we are right now. The day after, El País journal said that the bulletin issued by the armed forces of the state only had 273 words in it. 12 words per victim. When some months after, the Esquire Latin America magazine revealed that these alleged criminals were killed without any weapons on them, and a reader that I'm not going to mention in the website wrote they were assassins and kidnappers. Trash. Why do we want them alive? So they can arrest them and a corrupt lawyer would take them out from jail, forging documents and go back to what they did once again. And this social disgrace, not even one of them is worth the people that were killed. Today, the results of this investigation has been classified as a top secret for 12 years. Using Vallejo, we can say so much hate makes us accomplices of death. The other veil that puts a division between us and the death is racism in our society. Many people become invisible because they have brown skin and will never be on the screens, on the TV, or the billboards on the streets because their bodies and their faces do not correspond to the ideal white beauty stereotype that we see in the media, because the way they speak, the way they dress is not compatible with that aspirational ideal of success and prosperity promulgated by the elites that picture themselves as cosmopolites and white. An example of this blurry situation is the Little Alondra case. In October 2012, in Guadalajara, someone driving find a blonde, light-eyed girl with brown kids that they were begging around the area. So he concluded that this blonde girl must have been kidnapped. Therefore, he took a picture with his mobile phone and went to the police to denounce this alleged crime. When the authorities said that, that they could only hear the victims of that minor, he posted this picture in Facebook so he could look for the parents, an imaginary set of parents. So he said that this is a blonde kid and her parents can't be brown. And in air quotes, he said that this girl must have been kidnapped and attacked. So the image went viral with more than 60,000 reposts. Another woman wrote, "If you can see it with the lens, yes, she must have been kidnapped not long ago because she looks that she's well fed and comes from a decent house." According to this reasoning, this proof that she was well kept can only confirm that she was the victim of a crime. And as an evident reaction of this storm in social networks, so they went for this blondie and with the aunt and the brown siblings. She explained that his father was a tourist from the U.S. and she showed the birth certificate. And the DIF broke this family, not even when the DNA proved that his father was blonde. and not that was not enough to give her back to her mother. And the authorities described that she was negligent because she made her kid beg. So after 9 months of forced and arbitrary separation, the mother was able to recover her little one. Why? Why? It was due to racism. Why a blonde beggar cannot be? And many people are indifferent to thousands of brown-skinned beggars, children beggar. This is a very sinister alchemy that made it, yes, a goodwill action, but this didn't improve her life. This created a massive violation of her rights and her family's rights. So this lethal extent of racism lies in the fact that very frequently this type of invisibility happens in life and happens after life. How can we explain that our country is filled with mass graves of victims without a number, without a name, killed by we don't know whom or by which motives? How can we give an answer to this that no one cares to find why this happened? For some months, by the end of 2014, the intelligence and braveness of the relatives and the friends of the students of Ayotzinapa broke through the fabric of criminalization and racism to show its face and remember the name, to remember us that they had a name and a face. With this simple action, they made us saw what we've always known. Even we have decided to forget them, as all of the others are human beings, people with alive relatives of someone, citizens, and the list is endless. In the ID cards of these 43 students, we saw the faces of individuals that were as human as we are, even when 12 of them spoke an indigenous language. It just didn't matter that they were very modest in a very humble school. It doesn't matter they were rebellious or chairos with rebellious ideology. So we can learn from Vallejo and we can learn from the friends of the 43 students to open our eyes, to learn how to imagine an efficient solidarity with victims, with their relatives, with their classmates, with the youngsters in our country that today can be devoured by this necropolitics, by those who are invisible when they are alive, and they can also become invisible when they're dead. I hope that we can build a new generous citizenry that can allow us to hold them, uplift them from their bed, and to cry for them when they die and clean their wounds, that we can apprehend their killers. We owe it. We owe it to all of them. We owe it to ourselves. And we owe it for all of those in the future that would ask us to be accountable for this atrocious years. If we don't manage to achieve this, I am afraid that we will face another literary figure, The Solo's Child by Nick Cave. And when you thought that all of your tears were cried, the son of pain showed that bereaving is not what has happened. It is the past that you are about to live.
Thank you, Federico Navarrete, for this shaking, this tremor you've given us. And so many things we can say after hearing what you've just read. Now let's give the floor to Luis de Tavira.
I'm going to read as well in order to be more specific. But I think that I'm going to read even when it was conceived in a different field. It creates a conversation that is in alignment with what we have heard so far. From Wall to Wall, the siege upon civilization. The proposition that gather all of us here in this colloquium, it is linked as well to a powerful provocation to consider the decisive challenges that drama has to face vis-a-vis the spiritual catastrophe that we see in the crisis of our time in our civilization. A wall, it is of course an architectonic structure, but it is also above everything else a metaphor that transfigures the world, an axis mundi, a coordinate in space that determines the consciousness of our existence in time. Hölderlin used to say that poiesis is the capacity to transform a heartless reality in our own home. That is, according to cultural and historic diversity of metaphors, the world that we aspire to inhabit can be the promising land, a polis, the homeland, or the frontier, heaven or hell, utopia, the island, being outcast, a kingdom, no one's land, the rule, the empire where there's only a metropolis and a colony. But also as an architectural metaphor of a human home, the world can be drama, a garden, a hospital, a factory, a temple, a palace, a market, a labyrinth, a jail, a bunker, or a shelter. The metaphors of Babel and the labyrinth of Minos tell us that the world is a ciphered enigma for mankind, and by deciphering it, our survival depends as a human community. The estrangement of the world rose the bewilderment generated by cultures as the deciphering that has made it possible to have civilization. The conversion of the world into a totalitarian supermarket has made it very current. The Spengler's warning that affirms how ironic is our spiritual involution. The time has come in which civilization, which is the highest fruit of culture, is destroying culture, that it actually invented the world as the home of this warm community of mankind. The wall is an equivocal structure, is bifrontal and perverse because it aspires to become an intermediary in an abusive commerce in two dimensions that the world is divided in. The world that, by essence, is indivisible, respectively. The triumphal celebration of the fall of the Berlin Wall proclaimed the arrival of a borderless civilization was also a mirage, a very efficient one, to hide the empowerment of intangible walls of inequality. What that event celebrated was not the hoped arrival of a peaceful and civilized world, but the consummation of an economic globalization that by the end of the Cold War has waged the war of markets and the insatiable voracity of neoliberalism that makes poverty grow and destroys the world. The most plausible rationale to build a wall is always war. Its raison d'etre constitutes de facto a declaration of war. The walls of Trump and Netanyahu are bellic instruments. They attack more than defend. It is about prolonging wars that in itself don't seem to have an end because war has proven to be a good business. Thanks to drama, human beings learned to see ourselves as persons, that is to say, ethical and poetic constructs, unique and irreparable, of a consciousness that is able to imagine our own identity by discerning between differences, a consciousness that is needed to be a subject that exerts freedom in its humanity and finds in itself dignity and the type of sovereignty that constitutes us as subjects that interact, that in its most human expression we call personal relationships. That was one of the fundamentals of the project of civilization between that the Romans called citizens to those persons. And it was Terence, the comedy writer, who expressed the anagnorisis of the person in drama as the subject of a humanized society. Nihil humanum mihi alienum est. Nothing human is foreign to me. Later on, it was Rousseau, the first one to point out the paradox in history that shows how the developments of civilization has led to the point to reverse Terence's affirmation, and then it calls alienation to the annihilation of the person that results from such an inversion in his discourse on the origin of inequality between men. Rousseau shows how such inequality that emerges from development creates an abusive property that leads to war, and this arbitrary end, it makes it legal, that in itself constitute a powerful state that guarantees the well-being of the strong and imposes to everyone a covenant that represents the predominance of the interests of the ones that have more over the rights, the isolated rights of the ones that have less. This is a fraud. This is a fraud that precedes the threat of war. This is blackmail, and its consequences are the alienation of individual or collective rights, the abusive concentration of power that annihilates consciousness, dignity, sovereignty, freedom, and, in consequence, democracy. In arts, human beings acknowledge the power that makes it change their reality, this capacity of action that we call labor, through which humankind has not only been able to fulfill its survival needs, but also has founded its own dignity. That spiritual capacity with which humanizes matter as humans materialize what is human. An agnosis of labor freed from use, freedom from the form, humanization of reality, implementation of ideas, embodiment of relationship, art, labor coming from labor, sense of nonsense, and nonsense in sense transforms reality in the home of human beings, persons, peers, different individuals, equal only in terms of having the right to be different. Because the true work of art is society. That is why when societies alienates someone's labor in an industrialized process, dehumanizes the world and challenges the art to an urgent insurrection of a certain criticism that is able to resist nothing, that is able to resist how we're going back to barbaric times. In a super-producing society of goods, the relationships that once were personal have been supplanted by a simulation of social relationship between objects, and that creates an anonymous chain of labor. To the industry, they don't care what is produced and for whom. What it matters is profit. Trade is not integrating societies. Trade makes societies being blurry. In the market, actually, there are no things or people. It's all about prices and earnings, figures, statistical figures, speculations. In this unidimensional side of the market, the world is not real anymore. Brecht, the poet, in the times where this devastating mechanism of wild capitalism emerged, made to have merchants to the stage that now became investors and made them sing. Do you know what cotton is? No. We don't know anything about cotton. What does it matter to know what it is or what is it not? What matters is how much it's worth. Do you know what a man is? No, we don't know anything. Why does it matter to know what a man is or is not? What matters is how much a man is worth. The history of drama has been as well the history of an amazing history of survival, survival that has resisted ostracism, excommunication, expulsion, persecution, and multiple and periodical death sentences and sentences of disappearance. The most ancient sign in drama is Thespis Wagon, sentenced by Solon to ostracism. Thespis put tragedy in the wagon, and then drama started to migrate through time and history. During the extense medieval night, the wagon of comedy, excommunicated, moves about the walls of the borough and sets the path between feudal Europe and taking the news from one extreme of the world to the other, transporting this novelty of drama that made men spectators of their own becoming. And it was shocking by showing the inevitable condition of change vis-a-vis the different proclamations of the end of times. Later on, and even now, the transhuman condition of the comedians of the words have taken the traditions to the most remote corners of human settlements. We have no wall has been able to contain the persistence of this wagon. In the highlights of the Renaissance, Cervantes, that in another time was the soldier of the empire that had looted Rome, with an irony, unprecedented irony, he wrote the allegoric tragedy of the siege of Numancia to found the growing identity of Spain in that invisible dignity of Numantines, that by resisting to the siege of the Romans, by losing, they became the victors. A contemporary of Cervantes, Shakespeare, in the climax of the political dispute of the tragedy that he delves into very deeply between the political power and the aspiration of civility, he makes Coriolanus claim before the Senate. There's another world beyond these walls, and this is where we will find that indispensable truth that has escaped from where we are. We keep on doing drama surrounded by barbarians. We Mexicans are living times of threat. A threat that comes from within and a threat that comes from our neighbor in the north. Today more than ever, it is culture and art, the role to defend our dignity, amongst many other reasons, because if the fundamentals of dignity reside on ethics, its shape is an aesthetic one. As the poet of the soft homeland at the beginning of the last century said, "Homeland, your soul and your style want to die." But also here and everywhere else, drama is to resist the onslaughts that emerge from its own identity and threatened to set blurry boundaries between it. The drama of today is endangered more than in the past, when the mass media apparently gave a death sentence to it. As in many other times, drama reacted with vitality never seen before, with creativity and with transgression. However, today, its front line has depleted in the ecstasies of itself. Theatrality has reached a halt because its survival has reached a momentum that it's working at a faster pace, but it's in shock. Vis-a-vis that threat, drama reacted by making everything a play, making film a play, television a play, using telephone and the lack of communication a play, but at the same time, the system made reality a play. The politics became a spectacle. Sex is a show of advertisement. The culture became a performance and theatrical syntaxis. When reality identifies with fiction and theft when there were simulations of reality, when cities become Disneyland, the wars become films, leading characters an image, history a spectacle. What is in the hands of true fiction? A fiction to simulate that fiction is a reality, to be more real than what is real, to become hyper real? Is pictures going to imitate photography, or is drama going to imitate film? Drama is going to imitate journalism. The temptation is very, very great, and the danger is even greater. Is like being petrified by Medusa. This day's drama faces a decisive enigma. Siege between its pre-modernity craft and the depletion of its modern utopias. Should it keep on living and resisting in a simulated system? Drama has assimilated every single representation model, every model of anti-representation. It has gone over the borders of drama, anti-drama, dance and trauma, dance with words, words with dance, and total drama. And the dramas the world has lived a complete orgy. But unlike other things, the origins of drama was precisely an orgy. The experiments that made it possible to revitalize drama did not manage to reach the anagnorisis of the everyday life to transform reality and consciousness according to aesthetics utopia of modernity. Drama, as many other arts, through different media, has contributed to an excess of making it aesthetics, that in the use an excess of images has becomes banal in its trans aesthetics movement. If everything is drama, nothing is drama. The only fathomable future of an updated drama lies in how it connects with the other, what it's opposed to drama, that different self that goes beyond drama. This is the current challenge of drama, to express what comes from what is not part of the aesthetics, the content of such change. If drama is able to produce an epistemological breakthrough, a progress of the knowledge of criticism, the way of seeing or the way of hiding reality, it would be able to locate its new frontiers in the dialectics of reality, fiction, that its origin and its fundamentals. But if in change it only trespasses its formal limits, if it only considers the aesthetics of what it's funny, or if it only makes playwright what it's a narrative strategy, then it would only formalize what is concrete and will lose this opportunity to use the negative dialectics that is its most deep power, and would end up losing itself. The affirmation of identity also consists in knowing that identity is endangered. The current drama is trapped in the siege of the same old thing. The vanguard tradition of dialectics is broken. It's not either one or the other. It's the same old drama. Only what it's the other has a different type of drama within, and its discovery could invite us to jump over the wall. But drama in itself can only create what drama is. Therefore, we are in a search for a more dynamic, the disappearance of the new and the beginning of boredom, and that is where the agony of drama begins. The drama of the other can save drama from the siege of the same old drama. Victor Segalen proposed a new sense of this estrangement as a path into what is other from the same. estrangement as an acute and immediate perception of an eternal incomprehensibility. It is not about the simple equation between difference and indifference, but the eternal incomprehensibility, the strangeness that we find in cultures, in mores, in languages, in different faces. The drama of vision is a change between the idea and the thing, a comprehension that considers everything, but in our time, that kind of vision is enclosing. It rises the wall of the same old thing, the eternity of hell. However, a type of drama that renounced that totalizing vision, it's not reducing itself to affirm a negation or a darkness of an idea or a symbol, but it orients itself outside from the light, from the night, from the knowledge that measures beings into the incommensurable desire. And desire is desire of what absolutely comes from the other. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Luis de Tavira. Thank you so much for your very provocative reading, very provoking. It awakens so many interrogations that we are going to readdress in a few minutes. The trans-aesthetic of that which is vain, that seems to embrace all the orders of contemporary life, political things, and also the media, and of course the marketplace and the institutions themselves. So then, how to recognize fiction as fiction if everything else has become a fiction? This is very provocative, quite interesting. We still have a few minutes for you to write your questions. Now let's give the floor to Tsitsi Dangaremba. You have the floor, Tsitsi.
Sorry, I'm just trying to turn this off, so I hope I've done so.
¿Puede alguien ayudarla a mí?
Yeah,
Yeah, it's
There's no way
done,
to
no?
turn it
I think it's
well,
already.
it's
think
meant
it's
to be
fine,
off
okay.
like that, but I think it should be all
Turn
right.
off.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. It's my great pleasure to be here today. I'm really grateful to the Autonomous University of Mexico for bringing me here, all the way from Zimbabwe. It's a really exciting occasion for me because it's the first time I've been to Mexico and the first time I've been to Latin America, so I'm really overwhelmed. It's a completely different world that I knew absolutely nothing about. I've been here for 2 days and it's been 2 wonderful days, just taking in a little of the culture, a little of the people, so I'm really happy to be here. This issue of the harassment of civilizations and the use of art and culture in resistance is very important to me because of where I come from, Zimbabwe, in southern Africa, and what has been transpiring in Zimbabwe for the last 3 to 4 decades. As an artist practicing in Zimbabwe, I have found myself very much confronted on an everyday basis with the topic of this evening's colloquium. I'm not actually going to read, but I will be referring to my notes, so forgive me for looking down from time to time. The topic of the colloquium, I think, has evolved as the whole idea of the colloquium was taking shape. And so I think there has been an evolution of how to engage with the notion of art and culture in opposition to the harassment of civilizations. And I think that maybe some words are more palatable than others. For example, it may be more palatable to say resistance rather than revolution. I personally am not a great friend of the word resistance. Maybe this comes from where I'm standing as a black African woman, laboring under the sense that my whole life is resistance, and wishing that it would end and I could stop resisting and I could begin living. So I'm not a very great friend of that word. It seems to me to be one of these words that is very much in the same category as resilience. Yeah. I'm sure you've heard that Africans are resilient. In fact, Zimbabweans love to boast about being resilient. But I say I don't want to be resilient. To be resilient means I'm always having to reinvent myself in reaction to something that is saying you should not be yourself. And again, I don't believe that that is the purpose of life. Maybe I'll give you some background to my practice as an artist in Zimbabwe. The two really cannot be separated when you're making art in a country that has as many very critical problems as Zimbabwe has. But before I go into that, I'd just like to say that I agree with everything that's been said this evening so far, except one or two things, and I think I will come to those one or two things that I disagree with as I go on. What am I doing if I don't like to think of myself as resisting? If I don't like to think of myself as a Zimbabwean artist practicing in the very complicated and challenging context of Zimbabwe, what do I actually think that I'm doing? It's a question I have been engaged with. Zimbabwe became independent in 1980, and this was after a decade and a half of intensive armed struggle. People call it the War of Liberation or the Liberation Struggle. And we have in Zimbabwe a saying, or shall I say some people in Zimbabwe have a saying, that Zimbabwe came from blood. And although we had our independence in 1980, you will hear that phrase said in Zimbabwe on many occasions up until the present day. So we have a country that conceives of itself as having been born of blood. If you look into our constitution in Zimbabwe, in the preamble, we are told that Zimbabwe dates back to the early 1890s. The early 1890s was when we had the first rebellion against the British. And that was also a very bloody time in Zimbabwe's history. That was when Cecil John Rhodes had come in and invaded, and there was a huge resistance, and it was one of the biggest periods of bloodshed in the country. Never mind that the country itself is named after the capital of a great empire that is over 500 years old. The people who decided that present-day Zimbabwe as a state exists also decided to look at that trajectory going back to this moment of bloodshed. We could have thought of ourselves as having been born as Zimbabwe in that period of the Munumtapa Empire when Great Zimbabwe was the capital. But even though the name was taken from there, the perception, the identity was taken not from being a great trading center, not from being a great civilization that had many wonders of architecture and urban planning, but it was taken from the notion of bloodshed. Immediately after 1980, Zimbabweans wanted to put all this behind us, this whole idea that we are a society that is born out of bloodshed, and particularly we wanted to put out of our minds the idea that we are a society that was born out of the bloodshed of the 1960s and the 1970s. That was a very horrifying time, and it was a guerrilla war. And we know that guerrilla tactics can be more atrocious and more brutal often than conventional warfare. The change that happened in 1980, with Zimbabwe no longer being a colony or being a country governed by a colonial settler minority, was so great that everybody thought everything was going to be all right. And indeed, for a little while, for a decade and a half, things were much better. Services, social services were available to everybody. The economy seemed to be changing hands, and there was a lot of inflow of investment and aid, so that things seemed to be booming. And so nobody was concerned with such things as regulating the people who were ruling you. It was something that was simply not thought of. And even when countries that had also been through their own liberation struggles gave advice to Zimbabweans that, you know, it's not all about euphoria and simply enjoying this period that you're in. You have to remain vigilant. Everybody has to remain vigilant. We tended to think at that time that we knew better, and we didn't listen. So no one really thought that things would decline, that things would deteriorate, but things did begin to deteriorate quite quickly. By the 1990s, we were in the grips of the World Bank's structural adjustment programs, and services began to deteriorate. And as services began to deteriorate, those people who had fought the liberation war also found that they were not reaping the benefits of having been in that war that they had thought that they would reap. And so they put pressure on the government to give them more and more handouts, because there was a sense that we fought the war, we brought this country to you, so you owe us. And so on the 14th of November 1997, Zimbabwe went through an economic crash where the Zimbabwe dollar, that had been quite robust at that time, lost 71.5% of its value against the US dollar. And one of the reasons that is cited for this crash was that there was a big government payout that was unbudgeted to the war veterans. I can't remember offhand the figure that they had asked for, but every single one of them got this amount of money, and it hadn't been budgeted for. One can see that it could have been possible not to make that payout, but the government, which had come out of this liberation struggle and this liberation army, was also composed of people who were themselves war veterans, so they understood the implications of the dissatisfaction in this part of society. But there were also other things that were responsible for that. For example, that was the time when there was the war in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the Zimbabwean army also went into the Democratic Republic of Congo to prop up the government of Kabila at that time. And then again, of course, one of the other problems that we have in Zimbabwe, which I've heard that you also have here, even in the 2 days that I've been here, I've heard that it is a problem, is corruption and cronyism. And so all of these things led to this collapse. And this led to the situation where the state was even less able to deliver the social goods, so that the lives of the people began to deteriorate even more. What became interesting to me was to ask why Zimbabweans themselves did not do anything about it, or anything real. It's really interesting, because when the war veterans decided that they wanted change in their circumstances, they were able to put pressure on the government and achieve that change. When Zimbabweans found that the country was going through this crisis and delivery was deteriorating, they were not able to put pressure on the government. So for me, the question then became, we have this party, ZANU-PF, which has been governing Zimbabwe since independence and is still governing Zimbabwe today. It calls itself the Revolutionary Party. We were suffering under one dispensation. They came in as the Revolutionary Party, and now we are suffering under another dispensation. So what is the problem here? Is the problem with the government? Is the problem with the people? Or is the problem with the whole notion of revolution? And I've actually come to think that it's a bit of both. In Zimbabwe, we grew up thinking that revolution is the antidote to oppression. But as we have seen, it appears that this is not so. Out of one revolution in Zimbabwe, we simply came into another mode of oppression. And Zimbabwe will not be the only country that has gone through this cycle. So I've been really thinking about why a revolution should end up not actually changing the circumstances that it said it set out to change. And when you come to think about it, actually, it's quite logical that a revolution would not really cause any change. Think of a circle. Take your bicycle, for example. You hold up that back wheel and you spin it. What changes? What happens is that that wheel will go through a whole 360-degree revolution. But that point that you touched to spin will come back to that point where you touched it. It won't have moved. The only thing that will have changed is time. So it really shows that the whole notion of revolution is not really concerned with change in essence. It's really concerned with change in time. This is why we hear that revolutions are hijacked, and this is why we hear that revolutions eat their children. I have begun to believe that that is what revolutions are designed to do. We can think of air being displaced as that wheel revolves. So what happens is that there is a displacement, and time passes. But revolution should never be confused with change. When we think of those countries in which revolutions are being said to happen, we can see also that those are countries in which consist or which become a market for arms. So we really have to think about who is driving the agendas of revolution, even when people are talking about revolution. Who is really driving that agenda of revolution? And it's really instructive to look into who is supplying the arms to these countries. So I've had to discard also the notion of revolution. Coming away from thinking about revolution in the physical sense and relating that to revolution in the national sense, I then started thinking about the definition of revolution. And I found that there were 3 or 4 aspects of revolution that are common in the definitions. It's said to be a fundamental change in political power or organizational structures. That's one of the things. It's got to be a fundamental change. Another thing is that a revolution has to happen over a relatively short period of time. I haven't been able to ascertain how short or how long a time a short period of time is, but obviously we're not talking about the centuries here. So this again is important when we're thinking of revolution. The other aspect of revolution is that it must be popular. It must take place when the people actually rise up and revolt against their authorities, and people must be able to overthrow or repudiate completely these authorities that they are rising up against. That's also very important in thinking about revolution. You know, even if we are not thinking about national revolution, if we are thinking about revolution within groups of societies, those ideas are really important, that the people have to do it themselves, that they have to be going against some authority, that it has to take place in a short period of time, and that it has to result in a fundamental reorganization. You know, this is also for me something that I am concerned about. Because when we talk about changing anything, we know that we have to act on that object in order to change it. And we know that by acting on an object, we have to use a certain amount of force on that object. Now, force is a variable that is governed by time. You can have the same amount of it spread over a long period of time, or you can have the same amount of force in a short time. But if you're using your force in a short time, it means the energy, the power that you have to use in that short time has to be bigger to achieve that same amount of force. If you are using your force over a longer period of time, then you don't have to use so much of it. So if you buy into this short period of time formulation of change by revolution, you're talking about large amounts of force that are bound to do a lot of damage. So it seems to me that we need to be looking for some medium of change, some tool of change in society that we can use over a long period of time that is going to bring about that change that we want, but that is not going to cause the damage that will occur when we are using lots of force over a short period of time. And so this is why I think that art is in fact the only real tool that we have today to effect any kind of substantial and real change in our society. We know that inequality is growing in the world. Zimbabwe is also, like Mexico, a very unequal society. We have people with immense wealth. You don't hear about them. The pictures that you see are very much about the starving children, etc. But we have people with immense wealth in Zimbabwe. But the majority of the population are impoverished. Even those people who are said to be the middle class have, with the last economic challenges over the last decade or so, become almost impoverished. So how are these people who have no resources, who have decreasing levels of education because social goods are no longer being delivered, how are these people going to rise up in revolution? So I personally think that the age of revolution is over. With the market economy that has been spoken about, which includes weapons and weapons of mass destruction, there is no way that populations can actually rise up anymore and effect change in that way. So the only way that we can do it is through art. Now, why then should art be a medium, a tool of change? We've also been talking about culture. And the original brief I was given was that we also should talk about culture as a medium of change. I actually am not a big friend of the notion of using culture for change, simply because I don't believe that culture is dynamic. I believe that culture is static. And it only changes when this force has acted on it. And so again, one of the ways in which we can act on our cultures in order to change is through art. And in fact, we've seen this happen, even though the change hasn't been for the better, with the commodities that have come out of places like Hollywood that have people, even in the villages in Zimbabwe, speaking in American accents. But we can have the opposite also, I believe. And I think that this is what we have to work for. I'd like to ask a question. We had this beautiful poem that was read to us by Federico a little while ago. Did anybody hold their breath while that was being read, or did anyone have the sense of breath being held? Hands up, anybody? Yeah, well, I did too. I've just come from a scriptwriting residence in Senegal where I was engaging with young scriptwriters from the continent, my continent. And I had with me a trainer who lives in Amsterdam who had come to be a co-trainer with me for that. And the first thing he did when we got into the room and we began the residency is he asked everybody to hold their breaths. And then when people could not hold that breath anymore, he asked them to exhale. And there was that sound in the room of people going, Now, this is what happened for those people who had that feeling of holding the breath. And with that exhalation, you empty and you prepare to bring in the new. And this is what drama is meant to do for us. This, for me, is actually the physical meaning of catharsis. And so this is why I think that art is the only possible means of change. You heard Rosa talking about my novel, Nervous Conditions. Well, if anyone's in shock about that novel, it's me. Because the mad thing is, I can go to Sweden, I can go to South Africa, I can go to Australia, I can meet Nair from Mexico at an event, and people talk about that novel. And I've had people, even one of our deputy ministers in Zimbabwe, a woman, a young woman, said to me at a meeting, Tsitsi, I am one of your products. I had met her that very day at that meeting, yet she is referring to me as having created something in her that she now identifies with as herself. So for me, this is the role of art. It is to recreate us in a better version of ourselves. Mm-hmm. And I believe that this is not by coincidence. I do believe that art is a gift that we have been given to use in a responsible way for that very reason. And this is why you will hear that artists are always complaining, artists are always being persecuted, because those harassing forces that want to harass the process of our continued civilization are against the use of art in that manner. I think I would therefore say that for me, art did not come from orgy. But I would say that for me, art comes from a divine place of creation. wherever you locate that divine place of creation, that is where art is, and that is its purpose. Thank you.
Bueno, ahora viene el
Very well. So the time has come, the toughest time of the evening. Apparently, Q&As are not, but now we're going to set a dialogue. After listening to these talks, that all of them are in a dialogue. We've heard from different ideas of art, art as resistance. We've heard Sissi transforming force instead of a way of resisting. And an art can speak from a different angle to find closer bonds. And of course, we're in that process. So the first question that I would like to ask to our speakers, and if several of you want to answer this question, is perfectly fine. I would like to know when exactly in your lives you found that art was something more than an aesthetic manifestation as creators, artists, readers, or members of the audience. Doesn't matter. When exactly in your life you realized that art was more than an aesthetic experience? When was that? Anybody would like to answer this question?
I wanted to say something. For me, if I speak, I don't think I use the word art in my writings, and I did it on purpose. I wanted to talk about reversions and the trade-offs and inversions and reversions, and Luis talked about the others theater, and I think the disappearances that Fernando spoke about, and that spiritual or divine place that Tsitsi spoke about, which is a completely eccentric place rather. And for me, there's operations of changing ourselves for others, of going on your head and interrupt, of displacing yourself, of moving from one place to the other to create collectivities. I didn't want to talk absolutely about art, and I didn't want to exalt anything. I just wanted to really be hands-on. How do you do this? How do you do a silhouette? How do you stand it up? How do you take it? I wanted actions. I wanted the set of actions of those 5. I wanted to take that there and life in the scene and exchanging ourselves for others. That other where you don't recognize yourself. And I think Luis said it, and all 4 of us have said it. When we talk about transitions, if we're not able to recognize each other, if we're not able not only to change our shoes or put ourselves in someone else's shoes, and then there's something comfortable, something that is really fine-tuned, and something through which we can bond, creating a scene, for instance, in which we're not only inviting others, the other one, as the students going to the women inmates and the inmates with the students, vice versa. And this thing, the last person, maybe you wanted to relate to people that are toothless, illiterate, and many people who can read and are very extravagant in the very different way of reading. What does the university have to do in this place? And what type of scenes are created when you're able to tilt yourself, to do this inclination to interrupt your life? You're interrupting your timing. You're interrupting your own grades in school, your routes, and you are in this inclination, you are changing yourself, trading yourself for some other person. You're transforming other people's lives and timings as well. So those are the actions that are taking you this impetus, putting your body in there, that is being present in this scene, which is so excessive and so demanding.
Anybody else would like to answer this question? Sissy, when you were writing Nervous Conditions, of course, you were trying to tell the story of this girl, and she goes to England. She has a uncle. He was a minister. But did you realize that you were writing beyond that? That is what your readers find in that book. I don't want to call it an agenda because that was not in that rational consciousness, I believe. But do you know that that's being part of the book? It's being unveiled like the dough in a cake when it bakes. Were you aware of that?
No. And I'd like to just go back to your first question, because it's tied up with the answer to the second one. For me, art, and particularly literature, was a place where I discovered myself. You know, when I was concentrating on a television program or reading a book or watching a film, I felt that I really existed as myself. You know, it was between me and the text, and there was nobody to tell me how I should be reacting to that text. So I felt that this was the place where I was myself. But then as I grew up, having been one of the others who has been mentioned here, I realized that actually that place where I thought I met myself was actually a place where I was meeting that which was antagonistic towards myself. So already just by my engagement with art, I had this dichotomy set up, and it was something that I had to work through for myself. Yes, indeed, thank God. And so when I began writing, I was conscious of that. And I was conscious of the fact that I wanted to make the kind of writing that I did something that would, in fact, bring people like me to ourselves and not distance us from ourselves even more. But then, of course, when you're writing every word, you're not saying, oh, I'm putting this word here for that. You know, the creative process has to take over and the product has to grow organically. So for me, I think it's more like the intention than a specific consciousness when I was writing that and when I'm writing now. Because often I'll find that I come up against something that actually goes in the face of this intention that I have. And then I have to see how I can resolve that issue.
Sí. Luis, aunque Cici ha hablado de...
Even when Cece has talked about that she's against the idea of resistance because she sees herself as a woman who has had to resist, she comes from a country always resisting, therefore that word has not the same heroic connotation, or at least doesn't have that positive meaning as it may have in different contexts. So you said something very provocative, that the world is now dramatized. It's impossible to read fiction from fiction because governments use different tools and they use this dramatized rhetoric. It's a farce. It's a spoof, but we pretend to believe them even when this is a dramatization of things. You might remember when Colosio was killed, and you might remember after Manuel Muñoz Rocha was killed, and how the media covered this story, but it was a spoof. They used a medium. Yeah, the prosecutor used a medium, and that medium was on TV on a news hour, not in a spoof program. And he was convoking the spirits to get rid of a dam. So how can drama help us in this way to get rid of this spoof? I do agree with what has been shared here. To resist is not what we want. It's a situation that somehow, well, you don't have any other choice, but it can't be a permanent condition. For example, it comes to my mind this tremendous movement, this victorious movement, the French resistance when the Nazis invaded France. They did not resist to be resisting forever. They resisted not to be vanquished. And London theaters never closed during the Nazi bombings. They resisted. The show must go on. It's not that you want to be living all your life giving shows under being bombed. We don't want to close down theaters. So there's this idea of resisting that, of course, represents a situation that acts in opposition to what represents a threat, the siege. So that's initially what happens, but it's not what you want to be there. We always want to be victors. And we try to survive because we want to live, but to survive does not equal living. If life were survival, well, we wouldn't have life. This is not life. We sometimes say it, and we want to live, of course. Obviously, in the siege upon civilizations, in the process of disappearance, in all of these dimensions of those constructs that are the fruit of art and culture, against this devastating onslaught that attack what is human and would attack what the world is, there is some resistance. And there is a resistant continuum that a long time takes us to victories. Who resisted? They won. Some lost to win, and that persisted. So if we speak about resistance, it's a relative thing. We have to put it into context. We should not fight for resistance. I hope that we never be in this position to resist. I hope that there was no opposition between life and survival. But I see the life of culture, the history of art, and concretely the history of drama as a constant process of resisting that, for example, that has been successful. The wagon of comedy that took over the borough's main square. And then splendor rose from this wagon, and that is what history tells. But what happens is that resistance means not to accept defeat. And there are some things that, there are attitudes and principles that are unrenounceable. I don't want to make an apology of resistance. There's no other choice. We have to resist because we want to win, because we want to survive, because we want a different world. But probably it might be necessary in specific moments to know how to resist. And that is what I think.
Federico, y entre tantas.
Yes, Federico. And in so many quite provoking phrases you used, and you cited Vallejo's poem, and we had to hold our breath, and then we exhaled, of course, but we exhaled momentarily, just for a moment, I mean, because of our breathing. We're always containing our breathing or our breath, and so much hatred it turns us into accomplices of death. What can we do so as not to be accomplices of death? What can we do so that using these discourses, or perhaps finding strategies to escape those discourses, not to become accomplices of death when we're going through a historic moment in a country that everything talks about death all the time? I think that it's, how to put it, let's see, I think all the logic of my text is to think that perhaps the answer does not come from reason, does not come from thinking, of political, rational, academic thinking, but rather it comes from an action of empathy, of taking seriously what Vallejo was dreaming about, not so much talking perhaps, but contemplating, opening our eyes, because all these words of hatred and war, I truly think that the biggest threat in Mexico is not that the U.S. government of the U.S. president to do this to Mexicans or to criminalize us. Well, Mexicans have criminalized Mexicans for over 15 years. That's the biggest dangers. The biggest violations of Mexicans' human rights is not in the U.S. It's here in Mexican territory by the Mexican government. And it has been permitted, tolerated, justified by rhetoric of war and hatred, which is this rhetoric that started with a nefarious idea of the war against narco-trafficking, which is a rhetoric of radical rivalry, right, in our country. And I think the various attempts throughout these years of stopping, halting this vortex of violence have been contemplating, halting, deburying, feeling, grieving. And I think that 10 years exactly before this was so much present, Roberto Boñalos' novel, he describes one after the other all the women that are dead in this city. And of course, it's Ciudad Juarez, the feminicides in Ciudad Juarez, in the northern part of Mexico, that kept us awake before we started have so many killings that don't allow us to sleep either. Well, I was shocked. Reading Bolaños' novel, you have to hold your breath all the time. One corpse, mutilated corpse, found in the garbage dump in plastic bags and thrown right next to the road there. So what sense does this make? And 10 years later, with Vallejo's poem, I start understanding that perhaps the sense of all this is we have to work. We have to look at each one of those dead bodies. We have to describe them, not shutting our eyes, to try to understand the cruelty, the violence that provoked those deaths, trying to find an explanation, and eventually, I hope, justice as well, for justice to be served, and this type of retribution or solution to this terrible situation. And this is especially an attitude of empathy, very painful, very painful. It will mean holding our breath many times, and that we're going to have to be exhaling, not many times perhaps. And when we do exhale, well, perhaps we're not going to feel so much relief. It'll be simply exhaling to hold our breath once more, because another tragedy is coming to us, but we cannot postpone this. This is our duty. This is a duty we have as persons, as citizens, and this is something we cannot evade. Would you like to say anything? Yes.
I wanted to ask you, empathy is a very complex process. And to feel empathy for a teethless inmate, that other person, a maquiladora worker, a different color of the skin, I like to think in different mechanisms, but first of all, you need to see the difference. Probably empathy happens by noticing differences. I am certain that the first thing that needs to happen, if bodies are not bartered, so to speak, if I don't use a mechanism by which I can create empathy, because if empathy means feeling the pain that that other person is feeling by giving your time, by giving your emotions and your own desire. Luis' text ends up with the desire that you put on stage. And empathy is not sympathy. Empathy, I mean, there's some sort of synergy in it. There is some rhythm of pain that touches that other person if there is no acknowledgement of differences. And probably by acknowledging differences, this is where we see our desire in the way, because it's very difficult to negotiate class differences, language differences, but at the same time it comes a point in that scene of acknowledging that other that you hold your breath. How do you say breath holding in Spanish? Oh, I cannot believe myself that I don't know how to say this in Spanish. But yes, that's connected with something vibrating. I don't know, a poetic vibration in my case would be a pedagogical vibration of different procedures that make you feel the pain of that other person. Nothing human is foreign to me, as I said. But I have to be alert first because nothing human is foreign to me. I might fall into a trap. For example, we see ourselves as the best version of ourselves, but we realize at the end of the day, of every single day, day after another day, that we were not the best version of ourselves. We realize ourselves that we see that we don't want to be that. It is very easy to fall into hate speech, fear speech, and the exaltation of certain narratives because the media TV series in our country, for example. Why is it that TV shows are filled with products? They are called TV series. You can call them sitcom series, whatever. But actually, they're making violence speech. They're not presenting any novelty. They are not presenting that other. They are not presenting you with tools to be empathetic, to see that world that it's outside the door of your house. So it's some sort of anesthesia, and it is exalting the worst, the most nefarious values that we could see. So how can we defend us from that when we are surrounded? I mean, from that we have bestsellers, we have very successful TV series telling the story of narcos, drug dealers. So those are the products that are presented as art. I know that you don't like to make that distinction and you want to put it in very earthly words, but that is what surrounds us.
Yes, adulteration and commercialization and adulteration of things. And exactly the first formulation of catharsis done by a philosopher, not a theater man, a witness of the tragedy, is the privileged path of the recognition or the acknowledgement, first of all, through the capacity of horror, of being able to be horrorized. That's Oedipus, this is Antigona. And then from there, going back to the questioning, the challenging we make on the desire for life. I think theater is the art of life, it's a celebration of life. And the celebration of life has to show, I also say that the mission of the actor is to remind spectators the moment of his death, the hour of his death, because only with death do we remember we're alive. So then the contact with this evidently would have to be not of a sweetened empathy, but awareness of our own conscience. If nothing human is alien to me, then this crime is happening to me as well. That's what I would call, that's what the experience of theater experience when theater is really theater. This is what I would think the experience of the spectator is being. Let me go back to a few things and then we'll open to some of the questions you are sending me. Can you write happiness? Can you write happiness after everything we've said? Is it possible to write happiness? Sometimes we are of the impression that poetry, especially in poetry, there are moments of enormous happiness. We're writing happiness, but in all the other forms, literary forms, we always start from a scission, from ruptures, from cracks. Is it possible to write happiness and to write it now?
Borges said that there are only lost paradises. And yes, happiness exists, but in past tense. While we're there, we don't realize that we are happy. And when some time has elapsed and we remember backwards, oh, I was very happy back then. And so that's another type of happiness. Yes, of course, happiness exists, but in past tense. Can you write about happiness? Because it is a way of appreciating life. While you're living it, you don't realize that precisely that is happiness. Cici, you wanted to say something?
Possible to write happiness. I think it is in the past tense often, but it's also in the future tense.
También.
Yeah, and so it can actually, you can write it as that object that you are writing to, which you reach at the end. So there's basically really no narrative of happiness. It's just a state, but you can write about the journey to that state. And I think that's something that we should try to do more often.
Sí, pues sí. Sobre todo porque
Yeah, specifically because it's not in the present tense. Those are instants. To speak about happiness is futile. But when you feel it right there in that instant, it's related to love and desire. And yes, it's futile. I would change the question, can you write about happiness? I would change the question, can you write about kindness? Because we sometimes portray evil, but we don't portray kindness. But it's not always the leading character. Yeah, kindness is boring. Oh yes, only criminals have taken over the stage. Yes, it's a challenge to talk about kindness.
Very well. This conversation would take longer.
To write positive states is a malaise of what we say are advanced civilizations. I think I was just talking about it today, you know, these advanced civilizations have so much that they expect everything, and so they can no longer be happy. I think in places where people have less, they understand happiness
Yes,
and
that's
kindness
interesting.
and all these positive states of existence much better,
Kindness.
and so they're able to articulate them better.
¿No? La ternura, ¿no?
Yes, tenderness. Yes, in societies that are very vain, they analyze everything. The aesthetic process are vain. The rhetorical game. Well, there are many questions here from the audience. So then let me read at random 2 or 3 of those questions. This one says, how much can you talk about culture, Western culture, if you are the Western part is the limit of what we recognize as culture? This is like a metaphysical 25 question, right? Who wrote this question about the West? Could you paraphrase that for us? Could you rephrase it? How can you talk of the Western world from the Western world being part of the Western, part and parcel of all this? I think you have to go to the boundaries, to the border, right there.
See, that's exactly your question. That question is addressed to you.
¿cómo se puede hablar
How can you describe the West being a Westerner? From the inside. Are we Westerners? Are we part of the West? Well, at least that is what the question's trying to say.
Ok, rechaza la pregunta.
Because I'm not a Westerner, so I can't describe it.
Sí,
Yo
por
sí
eso decía
quisiera,
que era una pregunta para ti, porque
That is why that is this question addressed to you, because you're not a Westerner, so probably from the outside.
I didn't understand it. The question I heard was, how can you describe the West from the inside?
Something like that.
And I should answer that from the outside.
claro, tú querías decir algo.
No, que yo diría
You wanted to say something, Claudio. Well, Mexico being part of the West, it's an illusion of certain elites. That's how they pretend to be privileged socially, and that's how they have dominated the Mexican society, and they have imposed that privilege to the rest of the society, but it's not the effective reality from most of the cultures that are present in this country. So what stands out in Mexico, and that's very interesting in Mexico and Latin America, is that we are and we're not. We're right in the boundary that we believe more of what we really are, and we are less from what we actually believe to be. And there is some ambiguity here, but we have to question exactly that insistence of defining ourselves and giving value to ourselves if we are close to that imported ideal of civilization that our intellectuals have profited from bringing this assimilated ideas that in the last 120 years they have taken from abroad, and they have digested and redigested these ideas and later presented to us, because that's very costly. We have to analyze the costs of trying to be a Westerner and the effects in the Mexican society to impose that identity of the West that has been an imposition that has destroyed, that has devalued, and has imposed other cultures, other ways of being, other values, other ways of being an individual, and that still happens. I mean, we in a country we have so many indigenous groups, it is impossible that someone like Mary Chui cannot run for presidential office when the rhetoric to favor indigenous peoples have been very profitable.
Yes, that I think we should also think, what do we mean by Western culture? What we call Western culture is the result, the historic result of a synthesis between the Roman Hellenization and the Judeo-Christian Middle East, this fusion, this merger, that's the Western world. We would have to consider the dynamic of syncretism. If we reach that Spain, the previous Spain that has the syncretism, and that's what we are Mexicans, that's what it was, the 800 years of Arab domination. So where are we exactly putting the idea of that which is Western and Occidental? This is Mexico. This is a syncretism, dynamic, vital, tremendous syncretism. That's what Mexico. Well, Mexico is a Western country. How to call Mexico? I like the Alfonso Reyes essay. We are a country looking at the Gulf. When we have the Pacific Ocean, we're looking towards the West Europe instead of looking east. So then that's where this estrangement of the eternal Occidentalization or Westernization. This is something we can say from a syncretizing dynamic as the one Mexicans belong to, a very different manner of doing this from the Eurocentric stance. That's what I would call what Federico was referring to, more Eurocentrist than anything else, I mean, and not what we call Western. As such, Nietzsche said, we continue being Greek because we continue speaking Greek, and we say physics and theater, and we say category, and we continue saying, they continue naming us. But Christianity comes from Judaism, and that's Eastern, Oriental, and to a great extent, North African as well. So I think there we would have to place this issue. And we also say we're here in the meantime, as in the interim, I think we're running out of time. We have time for a couple of questions. This one says, how has art been able to express itself in contemporary cities that have been built under merely economic market ideas?
How can art manifest in contemporary cities if cities are being built now upon market-based ideas? I would say that any moment of empathy, recognizing the other, interruption, diagonal, what they call the queer, comes from German, out from the main axis. So it takes you to the boundary, to the crossroads, where men and women are, the West and the East, where desires find a meeting point. And when you have different standpoints, I believe that in the cities you can find otherness, to find your limits, to move between that space between where you are and the limits, to create a movement probably, and to say, here I am. I loved that one of the moments in prison where they have 3 times roll call, so they have to run and say, here I am. and they have to stand in line and they have to say, here I am, when there's roll call, when the warden comes, and they were here I am, I'm here in this workshop. Where are you saying, here I am? What kind of embodiment are we experiencing? In which stage? Here I am where? I am embodying what? And I'm prone to do what? And to do is to cross borders and use your body for that. And that happens every day in a city. At school, in the classroom, in public transportation.
I feel that we need to take heart, and we don't need to see this assault upon us and our civilizations as something that is going to annihilate us in any way. We even see that from one of the centers of the assault, your northern neighbor, there is a lot of reaction to that, and people are looking at other ways of being. So I think simply the fact that we are here and we are human means that art is going to persist. Art was one of the first forms, first ways that people engage with the world around them. I mean, look at your own ancient cultures here and all the wonderful things that are being discovered now. It is something that human beings inherently do. Where I come from, we have the ancient rock paintings and things like this. And so that art has been commodified does not mean that commodifying art will succeed in destroying art. Everywhere we will have people with that heart that stands for the truth. That is the difference between the change that comes from art and the change that comes from these processes that we might call resistance or revolution. Once things become too organized, they develop discourses around them. And discourse can then engender a distance between that which caused the discourse and the discourse itself. And so for me, that is the value of art, because it actually is predicated on truth. Art is predicated on my truth. And it is this truth that is told to somebody else that some of us have been calling the other. And the other recognizes this truth as my truth also, and it becomes our truth. And I don't think that this is a process that anything can stop.
Parece que muchas de las preguntas
I think many other questions are being made in a very good direction because they're being answered before they are being asked. The role of the artist, the role of market, those have already been answered. So how to demand art to be part of resistance when it's institutionalized? What do you mean institutionalized? Theater cannot be institutionalized. The management, yes, politics, the programming of actions, or the structures to harass it or to incentivize it, yes, but not art. Art is never institutionalized to start with. Well, I think that with this, we're going to be concluding our panel. We've gone way beyond our time. Thank you so much to all of you. Thank you, everyone attending this meeting. It's been wonderful.
Pues muchas gracias a...
We want to thank our panelists of this afternoon. Thank you, Rosa Beltran. Our dear Rosa Beltran, thank you. We invite you to continue following this colloquium. This is not over. It will continue in the city of Guadalajara as of Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. I know you can't go to Guadalajara. There were people from there that were not able to come here, and that you can follow it through the streaming and our webpage and acososalaCivilizacion.mx. From there, you can follow what comes. The program, you will also find it in the website or in the program you have with you. Thank you.
Bueno, pues maravilloso.
Las ponencias anteriores
¿cuántas
también
veces
las
has
pueden
comentado,
encontrar.
Rojas?
Están
And the presentations are also available in the YouTube channel of Cultura UNAM in Spanish. On our website, you can find the website.